hear me?
Hey, yep.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Greg Sanderson. I'm a technical specialist at K2. I support our business development team here in the Eastern United States and Canada, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on. We're really looking forward to your presentation. Before we do go into Greg's presentation, we always want to talk about our sponsor and organizer of the event. That's Arcovis. Arcovis is our Microsoft Gold Certified Partner specializing in SharePoint as well as search. And if you ever have any questions about either of the two, you can always email us at info@arcovis.com or tweet to us at arcovis.city.
Am I loud enough for everybody?
You sound great.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Greg Sanderson. I'm a technical specialist with K2, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how our products at K2 can help complement SharePoint and your Microsoft investments for building some great workflows that take advantage, as I said, of SharePoint without code. And these can be simple workflows, maybe something like an expense approval process, vacation requests, all the way up to something more complex like a whole new employee onboarding or some line of business type application. So what is K2? K2 is really a platform for automating process-driven applications. It really provides, what we do is we provide the entire life cycle support for a business process. From everything from forms to data integration to the user experience. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But just a couple of things that I'd like to point out. We are a Microsoft Partner Gold ISV, and I definitely encourage you to go out to www.k2.com, check out some of our case studies. There's K2 TV, some videos. You can actually try out our product based off of the website. K2 Underground is another great site to check out. It's our community site. You can see blogs and forums and code samples and things like that. See what people are saying about K2 and how they're using it. So again, just to give you a better idea of, and that's not really coming across that great on the screen. I have some animation in there, but see if I can get it going. I guess not. But let me just talk through it. When I talked about full support for a business process lifecycle, you think about what goes into building an application, or what goes into building a workflow and all the different pieces around it. You think about the end user experience and being able to present a form that somebody can fill out, or presenting data so somebody can make a decision. You need to think about information. There's going to be information residing in maybe in your enterprise systems or data stores, maybe in SharePoint, maybe it's new data that's being created to start a process. Typically, when you're thinking about a process-driven application, there's people involved. It's a human to system to human type workflow. And so it's good to know who people are, what does their profile data look like, who's their manager, which office are they from, department, et cetera, all the information you might find in Active Directory, for example, knowing when they're in the office, when they're out of the office, who reports to who, et cetera. Business requirements, your policies, what makes your workflow unique, what makes your process-driven applications unique, and being able to configure that into a workflow. Task management is another huge piece. How do we want to surface when somebody needs to approve something, whether that's a manager or maybe a department head, expense report approval, any process that requires some type of approval, how do we want to enable that process? Maybe it's a web part that sits in SharePoint, similar to a SharePoint task list, but we have K2 work list. Maybe we want to surface that on somebody's mobile phone, their BlackBerry or their iPhone, to be able to quickly on the go approve something. That's another important piece. So that human task management is part of this. Reporting is, I always talk about reporting probably too much, but it is important to know for a process, who did what, when did they do it, who did it, why did they do it, what data came through, and then if you can even combine business data with your process data into some nice rich reporting, whether you get into business and BI and dashboarding and things like that, you can surface that in SharePoint. I mean, that's a pretty powerful component of process management. And then, really thinking about it all is having the design experience, having different designers. K2 has 3 different designers tailored at different people, or I should say different skill sets within the organization, and I'm going to show some of that today. But, being able to, actually design a process without code in a nice, user-friendly, web-based manner, that's intuitive. It makes sense to a business user. You can take some of the burden off of IT with that. And so I'm going to actually show a demo now. Okay. I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen.
Everyone can click yes on the top if you can see a screen. I can see it.
Okay, great. Okay. So, and you guys can see the SharePoint page, okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to start off by building a simple process and show you one of K2's design tools. It's called K2 Designer for SharePoint. It's a Silverlight experience. It's web-based, and it launches right from a list or library in SharePoint. So I could go, for example, to my Shared Documents folder, click on the Library tab, and then there's a K2 Process button in the ribbon that I click on, and this launches the K2 Designer for SharePoint. And again, this is going to be a SharePoint-based workflow off of a list or library. One thing to note is that K2 does have other designers that are more client-based, even one for Visual Studio if you needed, if a developer needed to get involved in a process. And it allows you to build workflows outside of SharePoint. You can, of course, still, and SharePoint's great for the user experience and surfacing the data and reporting and so forth. So you could always use SharePoint as your general UI, but getting outside of this designer, you also have the ability to build nice, rich business objects that allows you to get at some of your enterprise data and bring those into processes. But let me just start for now with this K2 Designer for SharePoint. So I'm not going to edit an existing process or reuse something that somebody else may have already started, or I could always use something that somebody else did or I did as a template for a new workflow, but I'm just going to create a new process. And what that does is it opens up the process definition wizard, and so I just need to kind of define what am I going to do. And so the equivalent of this would be the beginning steps in SharePoint Designer. How do we want to kick off a workflow? What do we want to name it? I'm just going to name this document approval, and we can say that it can be started when either manually or when a new item is created, so when a new document's uploaded. We're going to specify a folio, which is really just a unique name for the instance, for each instance that runs through the workflow. Document name might not be unique. Maybe your users aren't trained to name their documents uniquely, and in SharePoint there's no rule or property against having duplicate names. So maybe I want to use my context browser over here, which shows me my SharePoint columns, and I'm going to make the unique name for each instance that runs through the K2 workflow, document name -ID, because I know the ID field's unique. Okay, data fields. I can add data fields on the fly. So this could be fields that maybe you don't want to surface in your SharePoint list or library, or maybe it's a temporary holding field to do some type of calculation. I'm not going to add anything now because I can always add them on the fly later, and you'll see that later on in the demo. Which fields do I want to display on the start form? Okay, I don't have to use the default, new form.aspx, that's what it was called in MOS 2007. I don't need to use the default SharePoint form if I don't want. I can build my own, and maybe I want to have document name, title, and now I'm going to add one of those data fields, maybe due date, make that a date field. Okay. I want to have that on my form, and those fields are going to all be required for the user. Next. Okay, don't need to do anything here. Who has rights to this process? Okay, right now you see all domain users can start the process and also participate and view reports, but maybe I want to, and this goes and searches Active Directory, and I can search users or groups, and I can explicitly say that this gentleman, Brandon Brown, can only view reports about the process, can't start the process, etc. And I'm going to finish that off, and now I'm ready to go. So now what can I do? What options do I have to build workflow steps? Well, in the general folder, you can assign a user task, send an email, reset that folio field that I said at the beginning, the unique identifier, work with the data fields. I can call sub-processes, so maybe I call another K2 designer for SharePoint process, or maybe I even call a process that was built in one of K2's other designers. But we have that ability. It all depends on how, what the workflow looks like, what are the requirements, whether or not you need a sub-process. We can work with documents, general things you'd expect within SharePoint, check in, check out, copy, add, move. Same thing with list items, okay? We can work with Active Directory. We can create new users. And again, these are no-code solutions, so I mean, this provides the capabilities to add a new user in Active Directory if you want that as part of your workflow. Two questions I usually get is, well, when would you use that? One with something like new employee onboarding. Maybe you want to have that employee hit the ground running day one with a new account based on information that was entered into a form earlier on in the process. Second question is, well, we may not want our average business users creating Active Directory accounts, and that's a great point. All of these items can be security trimmed back so that only certain users have the ability to use these workflow steps. Exchange, sending a task, creating a mailbox, sending a meeting request, etc. CRM, so if any of you out there are using Microsoft CRM Dynamics, you can create entities like accounts and opportunities, contacts, and so forth, edit, delete, work with those. We can work with documents and so forth. And I'm going to show in a minute how we can, how there's actually more functionality than just that. We have different ways to have functions and what we call smart objects, so methods, create, read, update, delete type methods with data that exists in other systems. Including SharePoint. So let's just start out with a user task. Right? We want to assign something to, maybe to the originator of the process's manager or another person in the company to approve the document that was uploaded. So I drag that onto the canvas, pops up the user task wizard, and I can call this, doc approval step. Okay, and now I can define the actions that the participants can perform. And so this isn't, I'm not restricted to yes, no, approve, reject. I can type any number of outcomes or actions that the approver can take. So I can say approve, reject, and I can, I can define them, term them as I will. Send for rework. Maybe I want to loop back, and I'll show you how we can loop back in this designer. It's not always serial. Our workflows are not always top to bottom, okay? Lots of times we need to send something back to the originator for more information because it didn't contain the right information in the first place. So those are just, that's just the actions, okay? These are all going to go to new workflow steps. Okay, what do I want my end user form to look like? So this manager, if it's the manager that's the approver, what do I want this manager to see? Okay, well, they can see the original form. Maybe I want to add a new data field called manager comments. And again, you could use fields that are in your SharePoint list or library as well. We have access to all these fields. We can update them. But in this case, I didn't have that. So the original document library didn't have a manager comments. So I can add that. I can say that that's required for the manager, but that the other fields are read-only. Okay. And now who's going to take part in this workflow? Well, because we have the integration with Active Directory and we know who the originator is, well, we always know who that originator's manager is. So I can just say we want to assign this task to the manager. All right, workflows usually aren't that simple though. Lots of times there are different business rules that drive the process, drive the workflow. Maybe there's a specific business rule that says that somebody else in the company needs to approve the document as well if it's a high priority document. Well, I can add another group of approvers, okay? And maybe I want to just search for somebody within the company here. Barry Hoffman, and maybe there's a certain business rule around Barry being part of this workflow. So I want to always send it to the manager, but only in certain cases I want to send it to Barry. So I'm going to say only send it to Barry when the following is true. And now we have different things that we can work, different pieces of data or different functions we can use with this designer. I can work with process data because we're capturing all this information with K2. We're doing a lot of auditing and logging, keeping track of what's going on, who started the workflow, when did they start it, who's that person's manager. We have all that kind of information we can work with. We can work with document context. But what I want to show you really are these inline functions. These are going to be important. And so maybe we only want Barry to Barry to interact with this workflow when the due date is within the next 3 days. Well, how do I build that business rule without code, right? Okay. It's pretty simple, actually. So what I can do is, instead of saying the current date, I can use one of these inline functions. And we have different inline functions for data, for logical if-then and/or type scenarios, working with Word documents, getting content from anchors in Word documents. Let's see, Excel, getting range of cells. You know, there's a lot you can do with these inline functions. In this case, I want to work with a date, though. So I have a date and time inline function for add days. So what I can do is drag that over and drop it, and then I just have to fill out what I need. So I'm saying that I want to send it to Barry, send the approval to, or the task to Barry anytime the due date is within the next 3 days. And so using that inline function, I can just say, you know, 3 days from now. And well, how do we? What's now? How do we define now? Well, the inline function. There's an inline function under date and time for now, okay, or today. I think today would probably be better. You can just say, so 3 days from today, whatever today is. Okay. So due date is, you know, less or equal to 3 days from today. Okay, and that's just a simple example of building a business rule into my workflow. So this says we're always going to send the task to the manager and sometimes to Barry when that condition is true. So I can finish that out. And you can see that it starts the canvas, on the canvas, my workflow is beginning to take shape. And so, you know, what do you think about? What do I want to do? You know, what's the next step? You know, maybe I'm going to move the document to an archival. You know, if it's approved, I want to move the document to a different document library. That's my archive document library that's locked down, and you know, it's finished documents that nobody can edit or something. You know, again, it depends on what your business rule is, but I can easily, you know, my current site is going to be the portal I'm working in. That's all configurable, but I can drill down and go to different. You know, I could add on to the URL. You know, current site that, you know, /finance/HR, whatever the case might be, however your SharePoint environment's configured. But in this case, just to show in the demo, I'm just going to send it to another document library. Okay, I could add more steps on if I want to. Okay, I can just add another step and say a new outcome goes to a new workflow step and configure that. But for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to add on a couple other steps here real quick. If it's rejected, maybe I just want to send an email back to the originator. Okay, so we have a email wizard, and it's going to be from, and I can hard code the email if I want to, or I can use information in our context browser. Remember, I have process data, so maybe I can say it comes from the originator manager's email, okay, and it goes to the originator's email. All right, so there's different things I can do. I can say doc rejected, and you know, I could go to my SharePoint columns and pull over the document name. I could use that folio I created, which was the unique identifier, like I did right there, and then I can just say doc name. You know, and obviously I want to make the email contextually relevant, you know, for the user so they know what they're looking at. You know, and you guys, I think, get the idea. But I could look at my SharePoint columns here and use this metadata now in my email. Due date was one of my data fields, etc. So, okay, and that's the email. And then sending for rework is just a user task, right? Now this is going to be the loop. We're going to send this back to the, this is the rework. Okay. And maybe the only item I want to this user to be able to do is resubmit. Next, next. Okay, the originator form stays the same. I'm going to go back and uncheck this box because I have some required fields. Okay, who is this task going to be assigned to? The originator, right? We know who that is. Finish that out. And one thing that I didn't do was I resubmit is not going to go to a new workflow step. It's going to go back to the doc approval step. So that I just built a loop into my workflow, and essentially that workflow is done. We can just go out and deploy that, save it, and deploy it. And K2, while I'm out of here, K2 is its own workflow server. So it's not actually, it's not a product, while there are bits that do get installed on SharePoint so that you can use this designer right out of SharePoint, different web parts and reporting, K2 is its own workflow engine. It's not leveraging SharePoint workflow engine. It's not installed on SharePoint web front end, so we have our own runtime environment. It allows us to get around some of the limitations that you find in like SharePoint Designer, you know, some of these loops without code, etc. So it's pretty powerful. It's completely scalable, and it just brings a lot of benefit to not have it actually sitting on SharePoint. It doesn't have to match your SharePoint environment, and it certainly doesn't take any resources away from your SharePoint environment. So again, it's just saving this and deploying it, etc. So, but I do want to show you a couple more things before my time's up here. So let me go back to the home portal. Now, there's different flavors of the workflow and different designers, as I've mentioned. You know, one thing. Let me make sure I'm in my. There we go. I'm going to open up just to kind of give you an idea of a different designer while I'm let that open while I'm working here. So one of the other things I can do is you know, working with forms. That's such a big piece of the user interface. K2 allows you to obviously leverage SharePoint forms, like I built into that last workflow. You can use InfoPath forms to start a K2 process and to surface information to a user, maybe the approver. K2 actually has its own forms technology called K2 Forms that we're about to release and we're really excited about. Web-based forms, building no-code forms, and you know, that user interface to these workflows. And what I wanted to show you is, while this is going, K2 Studio is opening. This is K2 Studio is another designer tool, and just to kind of give you an example of what this looks like, I'll show you an actual workflow built out. Open that up, and go back over here. So what I had done on the SharePoint page, while we're waiting for that workflow definition to open in K2 Studio, I had started a new process called the job requisition process. And so this is what this is an InfoPath form, this is another way to surface a form for an end user to start a K2 process. And this is all built right in SharePoint. It's using InfoPath form services though. And so I could, you know, this again, it's just a new job requisition process. You know, it's an approval process where a hiring, you know, somebody submits a request to have a new position created in their department. And you know, the hiring manager has to approve it, and finance has to approve it because they need to make sure there's budget. It's a pretty simple workflow actually, but it looks nice because it's, you know, it's using InfoPath here, and so I can say you know, accountant is the position. I can fill in all these fields. I won't fill them all in, but just so that you guys kind of get the idea. You know, we won't play around with the ranges here for pay, but you know, I could say that the hiring manager, I could search, and this goes right out to Active Directory and searches. Brandon, you know, please approve. And that submits a form, and the workflow kicks off. And so if I go back to K2 Studio, and this is actually a new employee onboarding workflow, and you can see it's a little more complex than what was happening in the SharePoint Designer, but it shows the ability of K2 and what the platform can do. We can have splits and parallel processing, and you know, all kinds of different things. And even within this tool, I still have the ability to build SharePoint-based workflows. You can see I have events for working with sites and workspace, creating sites or provisioning sites, working with this in libraries, just like I was doing in the previous designer, documents, records management, user management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then I have quite a few other items that I can work with these events. So the job requisition process that I just kicked off looks like this. So there's some automatic or systematic, I should say, steps that happen. Like we provision a new SharePoint site and we update comments and things like that. And I'm going to show you this in SharePoint what that looks like. But there's some systematic type process, automatic events that happen, and then it goes. The workflow goes to the hiring manager for approval. So the hiring manager will open up a form. And so if I go back into SharePoint, Okay. You can see here that I have a whole page or site dedicated to this process. So I have the K2 work list. There's no tasks on here now, but I'll show you what the task interface looks like in a minute. We have some different K2 web parts for SharePoint that have, and these can all be configured and customized and so forth, but it just gives you an insight into what's happening with our process. We can see that, for example, there's 4 active job requisition requests open. Okay, we can look at active cases. You can see there's my new accountant job that I just created. Okay, it's in job requisition. It's been initiated today at 10:06. That's West Coast time, obviously. I can even look at an ongoing report that shows me where in the workflow is this instance. So this is an end user report typically, and what it does is it gives me the ability to look at gives me the ability to see an image of my workflow definition and then color code it as to where the workflow is at any given point. Okay, so it looks like it's provisioning the SharePoint site. Okay, so if I go back in here and you know, I remember the hiring manager was Brandon. So let me see if Brandon has any tasks waiting. Okay, so well, instead of waiting for that to provision and move on down the workflow, I'm going to actually just show you the end user interface here because it looks like I'm butting up against some time limit. So this is the K2 task list is really the user interface to managing workflows, okay, or managing workflow steps and approval processes. And this can be the K2 task list. This is what you're seeing here is just a web part that sits in SharePoint. Okay, but this, you could use your BlackBerry, your iPhone. You could even surface the K2 task list on an ASPX page. Maybe you have a homegrown intranet application that you want to surface the K2 task list on. You can, but the web part in SharePoint, especially if you have a population of SharePoint users at your organization and they're used to using SharePoint, it's a great tool to use. So you can do different things with the work list. It's also personalized and security trimmed. So unlike the SharePoint task list, you can actually see all your tasks within one work list, and it's personalized and security trimmed, so nobody else is actually going to see your tasks. Okay, I can even go and configure my task list and do something like out of the office. While I'm out of the office, forward all of my work list items to, and put your boss in there, put your friend in there, someone else, your colleague. You can make exception rules. So for all of my expense approval tasks, send it to my boss. For all of my vacation request approval tasks, send it to my friend Joe or my colleague Joe. You can build that. So now I have a task list here. I have it, and this was just a test process I was running earlier. But I can open up the form, whatever that might be. I can take action right now. There's just one action: submit. I can pause this until a later date. I can redirect it or delegate it. That's just accountability. If I delegate, I still have accountability. Redirect, I can give it up to somebody else. I can look at that view flow report that I showed a little while ago that shows my workflow definition and the steps. You can see that it was just a simple workflow I built out, and I assigned the task to Brandon. I can drill down and say, okay, it was started on the January 20th. It's been running for 5 days and 17 hours, et cetera. What's going on? What do we need to do? Obviously, somebody needs to approve this, but so here's Brandon, and I can just hit submit. And let me just actually open that real quick. And just do and we can see that that actually should, now that I've approved it, get updated in real time. It just takes a second to finish out the workflow. Are there any questions? There we go. So that you can see that the workflow actually updated in my image here. And I think I'm probably hitting up against the time that I have today. Does anybody have any questions?